I'd like to offer nothing to do with biblical exegesis for once. What I'm going to do is have a conversation about stuff that's been in the news lately that may well have caught your eye. I wonder if you've noticed the great hoo-ha on the results of the census data from the most recent census data, talking about the change in faith in our nation. And if you remember the graphs, it said that people who said that they were Christian went down that way, and those who said they were of no faith whatsoever went up that way. And we finally crossed the boundary between more people saying they're not Christian than saying they are. Or rather, more people saying they're of no particular faith than saying they have any faith. And I wanted to explore that with you to help us think about who we are as church and how we are as church. And I want to reflect on three questions. Number one is what pulled people away. Number two is what pushed people away. Number three is what is our prescription for the problem we've got. Let's start by thinking about the pulls in our society in no particular order, but it's worth thinking about that our culture has for 300 or 400 years been very deliberately stretching away from Christian faith as the ground of its being. You can start with discussing the Enlightenment and people like David Hume, thinking outside of faith as ways of being and thinking. You can then start thinking about economics and people like Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, ways of thinking about goods and services in a rather different way from within the church, where actually the sharing of our skills, our assets, is built into the framework of our economics rather than something we do as essentially a feudal society. Then you've got people articulating what it means to be free without God in a nation, the dialogue between church and state, person and state, through the work of John Stuart Mills in a fine work around liberal humanism about the freedom of the individual versus the authority of the state. And that foundation is built into the fabric of our society. So although we talk about the king as head of state and head of church, that strict division is, you can see that actually politics and our political framework doesn't have very much to do with religious practice anymore. It's more to do with how we can have a good life together. It is a product of the Enlightenment and the product of liberal humanism. That's led, of course, to a progressive moral change in our country. And I don't mean a moral decay by that. I mean a distinctive moral change, where actually the underpinning way of thinking about life is be broadly sceptical about things you can't prove and live a reasonable life for yourself without doing any harm to others. So it's a kind of a dilution of what we call the golden rule, which is love your neighbour as yourself. It's a kind of love yourself and do no harm to anyone else. And the other thing that's rather important in that framework of our culture is the idea of what a good life looks like, the vision of a good life. You see it more distinctively if you look at the holiday adverts on at the moment. TUI, who are advertising live happy. So the idea of a holiday is that kind of thing. If you walk into Decathlon or any other shop, what you see is this image of what good looks like, and it usually means smiling family climbing a mountain together with the nice expensive climbing kit together, because that's their good life. It's all of those kind of ideas. You're familiar with it, aren't you? The idea of personal freedom, personal happiness, and doing well by those we call our family and friends. So that's the underpinning of our culture. That's how it is here. But perhaps some of us would think to ourselves, well, but didn't we have kind of Christian revivals? And we did, really. We had kind of a couple of waves since the war that were really quite important. And many of you lived, well, of course, most of us lived through them in some fashion. So if you think in the 1950s, what you saw was a Christian cultural revival where Well, basically everybody was a Christian, and really most people were part of the church in some fashion. I'm not entirely convinced it was a Christian revival. I think it was during a time where there wasn't much else to do. So actually the youth club was at the church, and the choir was at the church, and everything, it was all there, wasn't it? Now, I didn't live through that because, of course, I wasn't born, but I did live through a secondary revival that we saw in the 1970s and 80s, which was an evangelical revival. So some of you might have gone to the Billy Graham crusades back in the day. Who went to there was one in the 1980s, but who got to the Billy Graham stuff in the 50s? Anyone here? Bless you all. Yeah, well done you. But really what was interesting about that Billy Graham revival was the core of the message really was to an essentially Christianized people saying, make real what you know. Make real what you know. Interestingly, what that led to was not particularly a revival in the established church. It actually meant that an awful lot of people, in fact possibly the majority of people who experienced that revival, experienced it and went off to evangelical and Pentecostal and any other church other than the stuffy Anglicans. So they rebuilt a form of Christian faith, and it's still there in plentiful supply, but it's certainly a lot less now. What there was, of course, in the core of that revival was a sense of experience being vital for our faith, and they brought something good back into the established church, didn't they? So we see something of that revival still gaining ground in some fashion through the London-based Holy Trinity Brompton Road stuff, which doesn't gain much ground out here in the sticks, but it does quite well in the cities. So there you've got the pull away, and you've got these two waves of revival, which nevertheless, we know from the statistics that we've described, haven't fundamentally held back the tide of people basically voting, we are no longer Christian. We are now people of no faith. So those waves were interesting, but they haven't changed it, is really what I'm saying. Now, what's pushed people away from faith? That's worth reflecting on. In no particular order, I would note the change in our economic life. Nowadays, most of us when we were young, if you wanted to buy a house, you needed one income, was it 2.5 times that salary to buy a house? Consequently, you could buy a decent family home for not too much because the market allowed you to do. Nowadays, if you want to buy a family home, you need 2 good salaries. Of course, along with that comes a change morally that actually an awful lot of people, more often than not, are recoiling from what they feel is an irrational fundamentalism that can be expressed in some of our Christian movements. The way that fundamentalism can be expressed is in the dialogues the church are having about gender and sexuality. That actually the culture within is, broadly speaking, resolved in their minds. It's not a problem, so why are you still talking about it in the church? Would be, broadly speaking, the way they would think. So in a sense, we, the church, by not resolving that conversation, we've actually pushed people away from us. And that economic context means that actually if you've got to have 2 incomes, and if your idea of a good life is that your children do ballet and cubs and scouts and this and that and the other, then you're rather busy, and actually church takes a very low place in your priorities. Then you've got the change in our moral life, because people believe that actually a good life isn't being bound to a partner who is unpleasant or abuses us, then we actually are much more welcoming of divorce in our society. And so consequently, the families who are already double busy with paying a mortgage are treble busy by trying to manage a set of complex relationships because one parent's over there, another parent's there, and we've all got these blended families, which makes life much more difficult to be bothered with the God stuff. Plus, of course, we have the reputation of being somewhat condemning of people whose relationships break down. So why would they want to come here for comfort if actually we don't say, do you know what? Fair enough. And then there's a kind of cultural, this thing we're talking about leads to, it is a fundamental cultural disconnection with people. I experience this quite interestingly when I go into schools. So, for example, the other day I serve in Spaldwick School, and I mentioned to a couple of teachers, because we were talking about me taking assemblies, and I mentioned the point that actually, well, isn't there still a legal duty for it to be a religious assembly, essentially Christian assembly, and therefore, what would you like me to do about that? And bless them, those teachers said, oh, no, that's not true, no. And I thought, hold on, I'm sure I know my stuff here. So I got home, and I checked the internet, and yes, it is still in statute that schools, whether Christian or otherwise, have to have a Christian-based religious assembly. But the core of teachers in our country, through all education, do not believe that is the case and do not do that. So Christianity is not the core of our education anymore. The other thing I noticed when I was in a school the other day, having a good time with some children, I realised as I was trying to explain the ethics of Jesus, the idea of the God incarnate who comes to us, that these children do not have this as their fundamental background of education about how we believe in God. For them, this was quite opaque, quite new. For you and I, this was quite normal. This was the usual. And you can add probably ways that we've pushed them away is the integrity of priests being impugned by issues around domestic abuse and things like that. There's other lists. Now, the answer, of course, to this is not to be different in some senses. I think there is a sense where we as the church have to recognise that to our culture, we are very odd. You are very odd. You don't look odd. But let's just outline how odd you are. You come here on a Sunday and you sing rather ancient songs to a God who may or may not be there. You have a meal together where it is actively described as the body and blood of Christ, who we believe is God incarnate. You just need to realise how odd that is to everybody out there. It is really odd. You are now, and I think it's worth noting, you are now a kind of outpost, a kind of, not the core of the culture, you're an outpost of religion in a culture that fundamentally isn't now. Now that needs to start shaping our thinking as a church, knowing we are odd and learning how to be odd without being too off-putting. And I'd like to offer some suggestions, the prescription for these issues, if I may. So my prescription starts with, well, it's 3 main points. Be odd, but be within reach. We'll explore that a little bit. Secondly, accompany the explorers. And thirdly, prioritising outsiders' needs. And this is where we go from interesting social analysis to some very practical stuff about the practice of our religion. Be odd, but be within reach. And so I'd like to offer some comments about music. So seeing as this is the church I serve in, I have a little bit more right to comment on it than most. So when it comes to music, which is a primary thing we do when we're in church, given children today particularly sing singable pop songs with a screen in front of them, we have a bit of thinking to do. So maybe we need to think about singing singable songs. Not songs that we like, but songs that actually, if a visitor came, they would recognise how to sing it. And bearing in mind, all the children I serve do not sing with a book in front of them. They sing with a screen in front of them. This is their language of how they do that. It's worth reflecting. I went yesterday. I was invited to the guide's 100th birthday yesterday in back of the Mandeville Hall. It was very lovely of them to invite me. And these sweet girls, they came in and said, "Can I get you a cup of tea? And can I make you a cake?" Because I felt a bit out of sorts. I realised I was in a culture I didn't understand. I've realised, even though I have 2 children, they're now adults, and I've realised I don't speak teenage girl anymore. So I was quite uncomfortable in this strange place called the Guides. And do you know what they then did, just to make me feel even odder, is they then went into good old Guides sing-song for an hour or so. And I was sat there, and I used to do this as a kid, but you realise how you deculturalise on something. And I joined in, as one should, but do you know what? Deep inside, I felt really out of place and really quite embarrassed. Because they were singing, well, they weren't singing Ging Gang Gooly 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 or anything like that, but they weren't far off, were they, Nora? That was pretty much what they were doing. That gave me a real insight as to how odd we are. Do you know what? Nobody else sings as a normal part of their life. Nobody, unless they go to football matches or rock concerts. We need to remember that we are odd. So in our choice of music, in our choice of songs, in our presentation of music, we need to think about that. It matters because it's embarrassing and weird coming to church, if my experience of going to the guides is any measure. And it may not be. The other thing I'd suggest, and this is not an instruction in case anybody's worried, is if given it's so difficult singing together if you're not used to it, wouldn't it be a good idea if the choir joins the congregation? Because I've heard some of you lot sing. I'm sorry, but you need a choir to come in amongst you to kind of boost it, give it some oomph. Actually, it helps. I've felt the energy, it changes it, when somebody who can actually sing is amongst us rather than at the back somewhere. So I would like to offer that question mark. Maybe it will help the church if the choir joins the congregation. Second point, I want us to consider how we accompany the explorers. It's my experience in pastoral ministry, there are plenty of people out there who have God itching in their hearts, but they don't know how to do church because we're weirdos. So, if somebody comes in wondering how in the world to engage with this strange thing you're doing, invite them to sit with you. Or instead of sitting in your usual pew, go and sit with them. Invite them to say, well, this is what the words are doing. Help them find the hymn in the hymn book. You say number 236, a lot of people will turn to page 236, not number 236. Bear that in mind. And although people are shy and may want to slip in at the back and slip out at the back, if you happen to know them, help them to be introduced to people. Simple stuff like that. This is Nora. Say hello to Bob. They're a good person. You know this stuff, but do you know it matters? And how about you take them to have a coffee at Ching's and discuss the sermon with them? Did it make any sense to you or them? Does the vicar need to hear that actually he talks gobbledygook? Some vicars talk gobbledygook. Some don't. And you know what? It's also possible to express welcome in your home. That's allowed, you know. People are quite nice on the whole. The other thing I'd suggest, and it's an important aspect, again, a reflection on going to the guides thing the other day, is, do you know what? An awful lot of people like to do things to feel comfortable. So there was a whole pack of adults avoiding hanging out with the teenage children who we don't understand anymore, all doing the washing up or making the sandwiches. Do you know what? Sometimes to feel comfortable, people just got to do stuff. And that comes on to thinking about our third point, prioritising others' needs. Well, we know this, particularly the outsiders' needs, and that's who we need to prioritise. So first point I want to say is when there's an outsider in the room, tutting and disapproval are never acceptable at any point. Let me make the simple point. Children are noisy, and they are not trained to sit and be quiet in church anymore. If children are noisy, they are welcome. They're a blessing. Tutting and disapproval are never, at any time, appropriate. Something else I'd want to suggest as well is share your territory. We talked about inviting people to do stuff. Share that territory. Just because you've carved out your place for the last 50 years in this strange place called Kimbolton or wherever, where there is no duke anymore. The vicar is no longer the significant person in the community. Hierarchy doesn't matter so much, so don't worry too much about your place within it. Invite people to share your place, your work, your ministry. Thirdly, I want to observe and suggest, remember financial giving and the legacy of your giving. Just because church isn't being what you want it to be, it's probably important nowadays that it isn't. We do need to change. So if you have a big lump of money you want to give it without strings attached. Do not give us the problem of having to fix up something that you've given and you've been dead for 50 years. That is not a blessing. We've just spent 50 grand keeping these monuments up in here. It was not a good use of money. And the other thing is speaking. Say what you know and don't worry about what you don't. Anybody can say that God loves you. I'd like to wrap up by one other recommendation. We are joining in with the God who is love in our life. So the task we bring is deep prayer so that we can live in that love together. And I'll finish there because I've tried your listening patience for far too long. Thank you very much, and God bless you.